Okay, well, we're bang on 12 and we'll gradually let more people in. Well, welcome everyone to our first LGBT plus History Month webinar. This is an initiative that has come through our Pride in Maritime network, and we're delighted to have a fabulous panel here today. So to quickly say hello, my name is Chrissie Clarke. I'm the Programme Manager for Diversity and Skills at Maritime UK. We have had a fabulous start to our Diversity in Maritime programme, which was launched in May last year. Building on the foundations laid by Women in Maritime, we're shining a spotlight now on LGBT plus, ethnicity in maritime, and mental health in maritime. We have our 4 networks, and our networks operate as safe spaces. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel. We're looking to share best practice and ideas across the whole sector, but also understand the barriers being faced. I will, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Danny McGowan, who is the chair of our Pride in Maritime Network, and who will be leading the charge for this webinar today. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Chrissie, and thanks again to everyone for joining us. As Chrissie said, my name is Danny McGowan. I'm the chair of Maritime UK's LGBT plus network, which is called Pride in Maritime. You can find me on LinkedIn via my name. Please do feel free to connect with me there. My day job is as the international organiser for Nautilius International, which is the trade union and professional association for maritime and shipping professionals at sea and ashore. And you can find out more about the work of Nautilius International on our website, nautilusint.org, and find us on Twitter at nautilusint, and on our Facebook and via LinkedIn as well. I'm pleased to say, and as you will have seen, we'll be joined by some guest speakers today. Each of them will introduce themselves fully at the start of their presentations, but for now, I'm delighted to welcome them all. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jo Stanley, a renowned historian in the maritime industry, and she'll be presenting a whirlwind tour of a jigsaw from the 1600s to 2020. Later, we'll be joined by Charlotte Paddock, the Adults and Communities Participation Manager at the Royal Museums Greenwich and National Maritime Museum, talking about the museum's LGBT plus work and highlighting some LGBT plus stories from the collection. Finally, we'll be joined by Lucy Dale, Assistant Curator at the Royal Museums of Greenwich. Lucy will be talking about the museum's contemporary collecting of LGBT plus history, interviews with current and retired seafarers, recounting some real life tales and calling for projects or for volunteers for a project too. A really important part about the Pride in Maritime network is that this is your network, and it relies on the participation of individuals and companies working in the maritime and shipping industries at sea and ashore. Also imports and maritime business services on our inland waterways, and for those working in leisure marine and using recreational facilities. We want as many people as possible to know about our network and to take part in what we're doing. Those people who identify as LGBT plus and those who are allies to LGBT plus people. And while our work in Maritime UK will naturally have a UK focused theme, we should be under no illusions that our work is not reaching beyond our shores into the wider international industry, and we welcome contacts from around the world who will be taking part too. The Pride in Maritime Network meets regularly throughout the year, and we hope that all of you will sign up to attend future network events to help shape our work in the months and years to come. The most immediate opportunity to get involved in what we're doing, for those watching the live broadcast of this webinar at least, is to use the chat function to make comments and ask questions of all of our panelists, myself and Chrissie included. After the presentations are complete, we'll have a discussion and a question and answer session about all of the themes we've discussed. So please do send through your questions to us during those presentations so that myself and Chrissie can collate these and we can cover as many topics as possible in those questions and answers. Likewise, if you have any comments, feedback, or just want to introduce yourself, then please do this as we're going along. So, Let's get down to business and celebrate LGBT plus History Month with our first guest speaker, Dr. Jo Stanley. Jo, while Paul is setting up your PowerPoint presentation, please do tell us a little bit about yourself and go ahead with your whirlwind tour of a jigsaw.
Right, thank you very much, Paul. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to see you and really nice to feel that we're celebrating today. Is this hearing level okay?
Perfect for me,
Okay,
Jo.
okay, right, thank you. Okay, so I realized this morning that I've actually spent the last 20 years gossiping on sofas with LGBT seafarers and having a really lovely time, particularly off the record. That produced a book that I co-wrote with Paul Baker and an exhibition at Merseyside Maritime Museum. So some of that is going to be the foundation for today's talk, and some is going to be the history compiled by serious Royal Naval historians who sat going through musty documents, trying to figure out the story as best they could, given that the filter was that they were reading stories about criminal proceedings against LGBT people, particularly men having sex with men. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so I'm very interested in connecting the past and the present. I see no point in talking about the history if we don't use it to help inform us today in all we do to make the world a more equal place. So I'm going to be talking about these things, each in chronological order: women, trans people and more, men, and then a brief conclusion. Next slide, please, Paul. I keep reaching for my button and I know I have to leave it to Paul to do. So the challenges of doing history, particularly obscured history, is the question is absence of evidence really evidence of actual absence? So the queer maritime history story is absent from recorded history, but all of us in this field don't know, is it because actually there wasn't very much LGBT activity on ships, or is it that it was so commonplace that it's not worth recording? Our other problem is definitions. So we have many definitions today that are useful, including men having sex with men. And we use the term homosexuality to cover a very broad sphere, but actually, when the terms I'm using are just not really appropriate for earlier periods. So just hear the words queer and LGBT and homosexual with doubt in your mind. It's always more complicated than we think, particularly when we're dealing with such patchy evidence, often from hostile people. Next slide, please, Paul. So initially I'm turning to women. Next slide. Okay, so women were cross-dressing from at least the 1740s to at least the 1870s in order to get jobs on ships. So the interesting question is, were they taking the opportunity to just disguise themselves in a way that would enable them to go to sea and get better pay than they would as a domestic maid? Or was it more deep and about a conviction that they were something more than the girly that they had been brought up to be? So we can ask the question, were they, when they flirted with girls ashore, as they did, as heterosexual sailors did, were the women who were cross-dressed doing this to bolster their fake masculinity? Was it part of the act, like chewing tobacco and spitting it out and having a rolling gait? Or was it actually that they were interested in exploring relations with women too? We can't possibly say if they were lesbian. And it may be that some people might have liked to have been trans, were that possible then. The three best known cross dressers are Hannah Snell, James Gray, Mary Lacey, William Chandler, and Sarah Paul, and who was Sam Bundy and who became a female husband. The picture shows you the standing figure in the stripy pants. That's supposed to be Mary Lacey, who was a shipwright. And this is supposed to be the moment when her shipmates discovered that she was a woman. Next slide, please, Paul. Remember, this is a jigsaw, so I'm making a huge leap over many missing pieces. In the 1800s, very few women were working at sea, and quite a few of them were married to the steward. So I don't know how much actually lesbian, bi activity was going on, probably very little indeed. By the 1920s and 30s, there were a few what we might call today lesbian couples on passenger ships. They shared both their cabins at sea and their homes on land, and they were each other's significant other, but I don't know if sex was involved. I've interviewed Nora, who was the partner of Pat, who you see here in her deck chair. They were Shaw Savile's stewardesses in the 1930s. And from what Nora says, it seems that they weren't treated as aberrant people, but just old ladies or old women who were pals. They were at least in their 30s at that point. There was one very butch femme couple known in the 1930s. They were called Colonel Barker and his wife, and they were not respected by the other seafarers, which is partly about the lack of male respect for women anyway, I think. So the women who were in this world, and remember they were less than 1%, were not part of the camp male subculture that I'm going to be talking about later. And we don't know how much it was just women having sex with women. I suspect probably very little. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture because we need to think about what women were imagining for themselves. What possibilities did they fancy? Were the real opportunities different? And one of the clues is fancy dress parties, which were very common on ship. So here's a gang of stewardesses on a Canadian Pacific ship in the 1930s. And it's interesting to see what fancy identity they chose for this. So there were highwaymen, but in skirts, and there was a cavalier. Obviously, the clothes you got to wear were a product of what was available from the ship's barber. He was normally the person who sold the fancy dress costumes or rented them out. But it's very interesting to see how many of them were not interested in being pretty shepherdesses. Thank you, Paul. Next slide. By World War II, Wrens, who began in 1939 after a break from 1919, they had the reputation of being butch and mannish. And so this is a cartoon from the ingenue heroine of the Daily Mail cartoons, who is importuned by the ultra tough Lola Pagola, the Nazi spy, who is obviously going to hit on her. Next slide, please, Paul. By comparison, this is an example of what appears to be a warm and free relationship. Nancy Spain and Joan Warner-Lorry were two Wren drivers in World War II. After the war, they set up house together in what seemed to be a ménage à trois with two kids, one of whom may have been Nancy's illegitimate one, but one was Joan's legitimate one. And they were fairly out for the time. Nancy Spain was a person a bit like Sandy Toksvig is today, very jolly and appearing on those kind of BBC radio shows. And they went to the Gateways Club. And the third person in their ménage à trois was a racing car driver. So you can see this was quite a dashing situation. This is partly because they were posh. Nancy had been to Rodine. It was much more possible for women who'd been to girls' schools to cope better with lesbianism or bisexuality. Next slide, please, Paul. But it was an oppressive situation in the Wrens and continued to be so after the war. The most famous incident, which is barely recorded, barely available, is that in the 1990s, there was a coercive lesbian ring. The Navy were very keen on finding rings of perverts, and this ring was exposed at HMS Dryad in Portsmouth. Wrens left a lot because they were accused of homosexuality or because they just felt that they couldn't be in this repressive world. This is Emma Riley, who was arrested and discharged in 1993 for homosexuality. And she's one of the people to celebrate because she campaigned against this injustice. She was part of the wider fight back and really is a heroine of this period of resistance to the unfairness of the time. Next slide, please, Paul. Coming up to a time of success, the 21st century. In 1999, the European Commission Court of Human Rights decided that it was officially okay to have LGBT people in the armed forces, including in the Navy. And one of the heroines of this period was Commander Mandy McMahon. So there you see her marching at the front of one of the early Pride demonstrations that the Navy had. The Navy got good quite quickly and even paid people's fares to Pride demonstrations, which caused a bit of ruction, like promoting sex on the rates sort of arguments. And Mandy went on to have a very public wedding with her partner in the RAF and now works for Stonewall. So here's an example of times changing and reason to be joyous. Next slide, please, Paul. So turning to trans people and more. Next slide, thank you. Female to male transitioning. This is just a little story from a newspaper, and it would be lovely to know more. Stephen Davis, when she was a woman in the Wrens, she felt that she was living life as a masquerade, and she kept hoping that nature would put things right naturally. She got married to a Royal Naval artificer in 1958, but she told the papers who interviewed her, Sunday tabloids, that after that first wedding night, I really knew I wasn't the same as other girls. And very quickly, the marriage was annulled. She returned to the Wrens, which you had to leave at that time if you're married. Left again and started on a course of hormones, which made her feel great contentment at last. And she felt, as far as I was concerned, I was a man. And the last news was that she was courting a woman in Ireland and hoped to marry her. Next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. The very famous female to male transitioning person, probably the most famous of all, aside from the maritime context. This is Michael Dilling, who transitioned with a number of really pioneering operations in the 1940s. He became a doctor himself in Ireland, and then became a ship's doctor in the Merchant Navy in the 1950s, including on pilgrim ships. He was doing okay. And then he was outed very mischievously by the Sunday tabloids, who really had it in for trans people. And Michael talks in his autobiography about the very difficult moment when he'd been outed on the dockside in Baltimore. He stayed in his cabin wondering how the hell to cope with this. Finally, he plucked up courage to go and have a drink with his usual mates at lunchtime on the ship, and he found them supportive. One of them said, "Well, we liked you before this, Michael, so there's no reason not to like you now." The captain too was very supportive, but Michael felt he had to leave the sea, which he did a few months later. Next slide, please. Okay, male to female cross-dressing. On ships, there was a terrific amount of cross-dressing for entertainment, for fun. So on Royal Naval ships, there were SODS operas, which stands for Ships Operatic and Dramatic Society. There were crew shows in the Merchant Navy, and there were these foo-foo bands where people dressed grotesquely, for example, in wigs made of mop heads and, with a life belt shoved up their jumper so that they got bosoms. And the interesting question is, was this simply about a really good bit of fun and entertainment, or was this proof actually of unexpected fluidity and interest in gender? Next slide, please, Paul. So some men really wanted to transition, and it was so difficult in those early days. So one of the things they did, taking advantage of being seafarers, is that they got female hormones, they got estrogen overseas. So this is the main brand that they picked up in pharmacies in Lisbon or whatever. And it's quite troubling because they were taking them in an unsupervised way. This drug was given to women to stop miscarriages and actually proved to have very dodgy effects afterwards. And also, some men, very interestingly, started taking them but then didn't carry on and married women. So it seems that maybe the availability of the tablets helped them explore a bit what they wanted to do with their lives, what kind of identity they wanted to have. Next slide, please, Paul. This is a tragic story and a very interesting one. This is about a guy called John Boots, who was a shipwright. And I think this may be evidence of a tendency by authorities to think queers are trouble, let's dump them offshore. So John said that facing his desire to become a woman, I consulted a doctor and was advised to go to sea, as if this was the place to put people who didn't quite fit. He joined the Merchant Navy and I think not for very long, and then left on marrying a woman in 1936. Here's the wedding. And then when World War II started, he joined the Royal Navy, and he says that he was wearing women's underclothes when he was hauled before the MO, the medical officer, which suggests that he might have been under suspicion earlier. And he said that they sent me home on sick leave, which I take it to be a discharge on medical grounds, a sort of polite dismissal. In 1958, he came to notice in the papers because he was having his divorce decree nisi going through. And he said, I have been in and out of hospital 6 times since, and I have seen 16 doctors. He was very happy at this point, and he wasn't informed, so he thought he was going to get a womb and be able to have children too. But so 2 years later, after this happy free moment at the divorce, he died. So I really hope it was not suicide, but that was common amongst some trans people in this period. Next slide, please, Paul. The most famous, of course, is one I think you probably all know, April Ashley, who became one of the most famous models and certainly the most famous trans model. She began life as a deck boy on the Pacific Fortune in 1951. And here's what she says about her experience, where she was bullied a lot. I was phobic about anyone seeing my chest. Instead of the hard pectoral muscles, which all the other sailors loved to display, she said as proof of their manliness, a pulpiness around my nipples developed. I took it to be rudimentary breasts. With great agency, she managed to leave the Navy after a suicide attempt or two. She transitioned in Casablanca, which is where Jan Morris also transitioned, and got married to an aristocrat. That marriage was annulled, and the judge's decision made this this very difficult situation case law for 20 years. It wasn't a judgment that worked well for trans people who wanted to change their registration of gender at birth. And the happy bit of this story is that April did actually get an MBE for services to transgender equality, and she is still around today, though poorly. Next slide, please. Turning to men now. Royal Navy, then Merchant Navy. So the main Merchant Navy story, Royal Naval story, is a story of punishment. There were 4 captains punished for sodomy and related moral offences in the period 1756 to 1816. And you can see their punishments cashiered and executed in one case. But the interesting thing to think about is, were they really being punished for homosexuality, whatever that meant, or were they being punished for abuse of power, for having sex with somebody beneath them, which of course anybody would be because this was the captain? Or actually, was it about class and status? Was it just that the Navy, as an elite hierarchical organization, didn't want senior major figures having an intimate relationship of any kind with somebody way, way below them in class terms? Next slide, please, Paul. Aside from the story of punishment, I think there's the story of love and comradeship. So in 1762, 2 seamen were punished for having consensual sex. So what's interesting that it's consensual. It wasn't there wasn't any inequalities of power going on. They were enjoying it. And so I'm wondering if the very extreme punishment was partly because They were enjoying themselves, and it was nice and natural and normal for them. 1,000 lashes is extraordinary. 200 to 300 lashes is quite severe, and people and surgeons have stopped lashings when after 200, when people have seemed likely to die. So 1,000 lashes is extraordinary. The picture is a picture that's been a little bit discussed with the question of, is it evidence of fondness actually? Here was the frigate Guardian in the South Seas, trapped by an iceberg, and Captain Edward Rue has got the ratings into the jolly boat, but he is now being implored to save everybody. And so an ordinary sailor is holding his hand, and one of his on the left, and on the right, one of the officers is touching him. Some people like me think this is very interesting evidence of a different way of men handling each other than we might have expected. You know, is it tender? Is it warm? Is it an expression of emotion, and not uptight hyper masculinity? Next slide, please, Paul. The most famous case of all time is the HMS Africaine. This situation happened in 1816. The ship was coming back after 4 years in the East Indies, so you can imagine how people were feeling after being away for so long. There was an awful lot of very in-your-face men fucking men going on. 50 out of the 250 aboard were investigated, and 4 of them were hanged. The problem for the captain, who was the son of the very famous Admiral Rodney, was it seems that indiscipline had gone too far. People, he said, were copulating in plain view like dogs. And yet, here's an interesting statement by one seaman. He says of one of the main perpetrators, and you'll notice he was foreign, okay? And this was seen as a Mediterranean vice, this men having sex with men. So Raphael Sirocco put the question to me whether I would let him fuck me. I told him I did not much mind. I think that's a really interesting example of relaxedness about sex that deserves far more understanding than we're ever going to manage to get. Next slide, please, Paul. In the Royal Navy in the 19th century, it seems that it was slightly easier. There was the last British naval execution for buggery in 1829, which and the final execution for buggery was in 1935. Sodomy stopped being a capital offence, and there were no courts-martials for buggery or sodomy or unclean behaviour, as it was mainly called. But there were people cross-dressing. So here's a very interesting example of a midshipman looking like a kind of chorus girl. And people were leaving. The figures are not very clear, but it seems that several, perhaps about 7 a year, were leaving by the 1920s, either because they were pushed. Well, I think these are the people who were pushed, but I think also people chose to go as well because they were going to get discovered. They might have got rooted out anyway. Depending on how sympathetic their senior officer was, this would depend how easily they could go. Next slide, please, Paul. So it seems that in the early 20th century, there was a little bit of tolerance. I put the tolerance-ish in small letters to indicate that this is not a big change. So it seems that some of the explanations might be that people felt comradeship with their male comrades, and this was extended into love and sex, particularly in wartime when they were sharing dangers together. Certainly, there were some people who were just enjoying any porthole in a storm. And I think we have to say, not least out of the loneliness of life at sea. The Navy had quite a few public school people in it, so there were officers, of course, who saw men having sex with men as normal. And also there was the idea developing, particularly in the States, but coming to Britain, of the sailor as this gorgeous macho stud who was the most desirable kind of man any man could go for. Next slide, please, Paul. I think this cartoon is very useful in expressing the feeling just after World War II, where there were enormous official anxieties about the moral decline of the nation, the national defense in this Cold War situation, and the threat to the gender order because of women having taken on such important social roles in the war and now being shoved back into the home. So in case you can't see it, I'll just say the caption. It's the recruiting sergeant saying, what we want to know is, can you kill a man? And the guy in his lavender boots, filing his nails, perching his bottom on the desk and looking completely irreverent is saying, ooh, yes, eventually. Next slide, please, Paul. So in this period, there was investigation, and it seems that there were certainly agents provocateurs working in the RAF. This was armed forces wide, and a clampdown was ordered. This was very much the Cold War, lavender scare in the US as well as the UK, and general moral crusading about the permissiveness of the modern society. So in the period 1959 to 62, 223 people left the Navy as a result of their homosexuality, meaning they were kicked out. So many more would have left too. We're talking about the noose tightening, really. And related to this, in 1962, an Admiralty clerk in Moscow, William Vassal, was found to have sold secrets to the Russians. He was blackmailed for having had sex with a man. And the idea developed and continued for at least 10 years, despite proof to the contrary, that a queer person was a risk to the nation because he could be blackmailed. He could reveal secrets that would bring Britain into submission to the Soviet Union, to communism. Next slide, please, Paul. Thank you. There were probes and then scandals. So in 1968 to 69, 4 ships were found to have had an enormous number of men having sex with men on board, and also in ports. This was in the Far East, so this would have been with all sorts of gorgeous looking guys they might have picked up in clubs in Bugis Street, which was the main street for trans clubs. Next slide, please. The Royal Navy responses to these scandals, very interesting, and was only revealed 20 years ago, not at the time, when the National Archive released the records. The main line was there were far too many men who'd had sex with men to sack them. The Royal Navy would have been inoperable. It would have come to a halt if these people had been sacked. Secondly, there was the idea that if it wasn't too visible, then maybe it was tolerable. And also there was the practical problem that weeding out everybody who'd had sex with a man would cost so much money, and the Navy simply hadn't got it. The Navy has always been short of resources. A homosexuality committee was set up, and one of the main people involved in this, Admiral Sir John Bush of the Western Fleet, felt that these were not truly perverts, he said, but that it was a mass of people indulging in animal behavior, and that it was associated with people who would lower themselves to have paid sex with women or with men, and he saw it also as related to alcohol. Not truly really dyed in the wool queer, as he would have said at that time. Next slide, please. You'll all recognize Paul Burrell, the royal butler. In the 1970s, high numbers were leaving. Paul was not in the Navy, he was a royal servant, but he was on the Royal Yacht Britannia when an orgy happened of seafarers, Royal Naval seafarers, and palace servants, and 11 of them were sacked, including him. And then a year later, in 1982, the Royal Navy found 4 rings of up to 12 men and prosecuted them. So this was really the height of the oppression. Next slide, please, Paul. But then the proud fight back was beginning. So in 1991, the support organisation Rank Outsiders began, it covered all services. The people on the phone lines there had so many stories of miscarriages of justice that a groundswell grew. They set up challenges to the law, which Stonewall backed, and took cases to the European Court of Human Rights, and eventually won this in late 1999. And then everything changed. The ban on the homosexuality and the forces lifted. Some people say, did this ban lift because of the law and the fight back, or was it actually that labour shortages were so acute that the Navy was becoming aware of, yes, just as it had to allow women on ships to staff the ships, so it would have to allow LGBT people in to staff other ships too, and to staff bases as well. This cartoon from the Sun, obviously it's based on the World War I recruiting poster, but the guy has a limp wrist. So although things had improved for people in the Navy, there was still that homophobia going on, and that idea that these were insufficiently Nelsonian macho guys in our armed forces. Next slide, please, Paul. Turning to the merchant Navy now, much more informal culture. In the 1800s, there were very few dismissals, and they were normally, if it was a case of somebody in power, like a bosun, abusing a boy who didn't have the ability to defend himself. So there weren't any cases that I've come across about consensual sex being punished. By the 1900s, and particularly 1920s, there was starting to be the idea on passenger ships that anything goes. They were permissive spaces. In the 50s to the 80s, this was absolutely the heyday, the golden age of gay heaven for camp stewards. But camp stewards were only half the picture. The other half of the picture is, as you see here, this is Alan, who's a radio officer on BP Kestrel in 1962, and he absolutely had to remain closeted. So he was operating with a Royal Naval level of fear. He could not afford to be camp, and it was quite lonely for him to watch so many people having fun when he felt he had to act an entirely impeccable heterosexual part. Some of you will know that I've been working on a gay seafarer called Mick Belston, who was part of this gay heaven in the 1950s, and he went on to be an activist in the Gay Liberation Front. He's the only bridging person we know that he moved from the private enjoyment of fun on ships to actually working to make the world a better place for LGBT people. Quite a few seafarers I've talked to said we had no need for things like the GLF on ships. We were liberated already out at sea. We did what we wanted. We had a high old time. Finally, the legal situation was regularized in 1992 on merchant Navy ships, but not on Royal Navy ships. And then the 2017 Merchant Shipping Homosexual Conduct Act was just a little thing to tidy up anomalies that people weren't bothering about anymore anyway. Next slide, please. So merchant Navy, why were straight crew gay tolerant? And they really were. Certainly in the case of camp stewards, if Alan, the wireless officer you saw, had been out, that would have been much trickier for people to cope with, particularly his fellow officers. So camp stewards were seen as boredom busters. They were sexually obliging. They'd do hand jobs and blow jobs. Yet they were admirably tough, so you knew you could rely on them if your ship was in trouble. They would behave like men, in quotes. In catering departments on many ships, the camp guys outnumbered the straights to the extent that one guy said to me, "It was de rigueur, darling. The straights were in the minority." And also, there was the immense loyalty that people have on ships to shipmates. The idea that he may be queer, but he's our queer. Therefore, we are going to defend him to the hilt from any homophobe. Next slide, please, Paul. So why did the Merchant Navy passengers welcome camp stewards? It's because they made such fun. Here is somebody on the Arrower doing a spoof version of My Boy Lollipop, and he's holding his 2 rainbow lollipops up. So passengers thought camp stewards were fun. They said to the chief steward, please, can we have a steward who's that way, you know? They actually requested a camp steward for their dining table. The camp stewards tended to be really emotionally literate, really good at behaving in the ways that were required by passengers. And also, to just bring in a bit of theory, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, has talked about ships as heterotopias. It's worth you Googling it because it's saying that ships were such exceptional spaces out at sea that there's a whole different sense of possibility. And somehow passengers went along with that, even though homosexuality was still illegal ashore. Next slide, please, Paul. So human resources staff in the Merchant Navy very much welcomed camp stewards. They said we couldn't have done it without them. The camp stewards worked very hard. Their appearance was impeccable, much neater and cleaner than some of the straight guys. There was the very useful thing that that women passengers would not be importuned. There were many sad stories of women being sexually abused and even raped, and it's thought sometimes murdered by stewards who had heterosexual sex with them. So here suddenly was now the possibility that bedroom stewards who were gay would be great because they wouldn't be doing these things to the women passengers. There wouldn't be litigation and scandal. And above all, because the passengers were so happy with their stewards who were like that, so the company was happy because it meant the passengers would come back. There'd be repeat custom. Their ships would be known as great spaces. Next slide, please, Paul. So going on to my conclusion now, just to summarize the differences. In the Merchant Navy, real cultural acceptance of out stewards, not officers, no courts martials, was much easier to leave. You just disappeared. There was solidarity and freedom for some, a great sense of support that carried over into life afterwards. So people carried on living a gay life long after they left the sea, but there was no formal support. By contrast, in the Royal Navy, as part of the armed forces, there was very much anxiety about what these people, these effeminate people, might do. They might affect the operational effectiveness of a ship, particularly in an engagement. Royal Naval ships tended to be more moral places rather than having the anything goes attitude of merchant ships. Because it was one organization rather than many merchant shipping companies and latterly flagged out. So Royal Navy policy had an impact. Being anti-gay had a huge impact, but then deciding to be pro-gay also had a huge impact. Today, the Royal Navy has got official guidelines and policy and is really firm on being entirely embracing of diversity. It also has an LGBT plus network, Compass, which you can find online. Okay, sorry, Danny's saying I'm a bit late. I'm just about to come to my last slide, Danny. Next slide, please, Paul. Okay, so thank you for listening. Do ask me questions now and later. These are the ways you can contact me. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you very much, Jo. It's such a fascinating presentation, and please don't apologise for going over time. It's so interesting. There's so much we'd like to hear, and so many more opportunities for people to get involved in what you're doing in your work, and in the work of our next guest speakers as well. What I'd like to do now Excuse me. What I'd like to do now is to welcome our next guest speaker, Charlotte Paddock, the Adults and Communities Participation Manager from the Royal Museums Greenwich, to introduce her presentation. Just a reminder to those that are watching this live, please do send any questions and comments through in the chat function to both the panelists, or feel free to introduce yourself to other attendees and participants as well. It really is your event as much as it is ours. We'd love to hear from you. So Charlotte, thank you very much for joining us. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks, Denny. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen, so bear with me. Okay, right, can you see that? Yes, okay, getting nods, wonderful, thank you. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And it's a very challenging position to be in, to follow Jo. So I hope you still enjoy my presentation. Yeah, so as Denny said, I'm the Adult and Community Participation Manager at Royal Museums Greenwich. So I'm not an expert in the queer history in the collections, but what I do is try to find ways for audiences to engage with our collection. And I program all of our LGBTQ+ events and projects. And so, yeah, I'm always looking for ways that we can better understand kind of queer culture and identity today through the stories in the collection. So just for anybody that doesn't know, Royal Museums Greenwich is made up of 5 different sites. So we have the Royal Observatory, the Cutty Sark, the Queen's House, the National Maritime Museum, and the Prince Philip Maritime Collection Centre. And I mainly work at the National Maritime Museum and the Queen's House. So I'm going to start by taking you on a very quick tour through some of the queer histories in the collection that we really like to incorporate into a lot of our engagement activities. So I'm going to start off with kind of the seafaring side, so I thought you might all find that interesting. And so first of all, this is an image of a crossing the line ceremony from 1959. I'm sure you all know lots about those ceremonies, so I'm not going to go into the details of them, but I just find these images really interesting, and kind of Jo touched on this already, in terms of the kind of ritual at sea that was played out during these ceremonies that kind of enabled people to play with the ideas of gender and sexuality and power. And I think that kind of difference of acceptance at sea in comparison to land is something really interesting. And we, you know, like Jo said, we don't know if anybody that took part in these ceremonies identified as LGBTQ+, but it provides us with an opportunity to question that, and to kind of use our imaginations as well, because like Jo said, there is a massive lack of evidence, because it has been intentionally hidden in the past, and so in order to make sure that we do make our collections relevant for LGBTQ+ communities, images like this really enable us to kind of have those discussions around queer culture. So Jo also mentioned this as well. We've got a few overlaps, but this is one of my favourite stories in the collection. So it's about Mary Lacey, who was born in 1740. She ran away from home and disguised herself as a man for an incredible 12 years, in which she joined the Royal Navy and became a shipwright. She then decided, well, she either was discovered or decided to come out and reveal her identity. An incredible woman. She actually was one of the first women in Britain to win a pension from in this country, and that wasn't kind of accepted at first. People really disliked that she had been hiding her gender, but just an incredible feat that she was able to win that. And she went on to build a lot of homes. She built much of Deptford High Street in southeast London, specifically for sailors and their families. And it's thought that she was in a relationship with a woman called Elizabeth Slade. And we think that's who she left her estate to. And again, we don't have evidence that this is definitely true, but it's an opportunity for us to talk about women dressing as men and potentially identifying as non-binary or transgender, and also potentially having relationships with women as well. So I'm sure you all know the infamous pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read as well. And just to kind of note that we do make an effort not to romanticize piracy in any way. But what is really interesting about these figures is, similarly to some of the other examples that I've mentioned, it's kind of the spaces that pirateering kind of enabled them to explore their gender and defy gender boundaries, and also kind of it kind of explored gender fluidity as well. So Mary and Anne both joined the pirate crew of Captain Jack Calico, and eventually became very close friends by revealing that they were both women, because they had been dressing as men the whole time they were on board. But it got to a situation where actually they were able to reveal their gender to more people on board. And so I find that really interesting that they were living between these male and female binaries. There's also discussion that they may have been in a relationship together. We don't really know that. But again, another great opportunity for us to discuss queer identities. So moving on to the kind of royal connections in the collection. So Elizabeth I was not queer. I'm not saying she was queer herself, but there are some really useful kind of queer interpretations of the way she presented herself. Elizabeth really, I mean, as you can see in this image, constructed her image very, very carefully. And this was definitely to increase her influence and her power. But she also talked a lot about kind of being a man, and being able to kind of rule over the country as her male predecessors had. And so you can particularly see in this image how large and kind of opulent her outfit is. And she was trying to build this, this image that maybe even kind of went beyond gender, as this kind of ruling icon. And we also know that Elizabeth is a queer icon in terms of dress and makeup, especially for the drag community. Moving on, my presentation has just frozen. Bear with me.
Thanks, Charlotte, for doing this. And it's got, just as you were mentioning Elizabeth's drag influence, I was just thinking I've seen costumes like that on RuPaul's Drag Race, I think, in fairly recent history. So it was quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually had an event last year in the Queen's House, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about later. But Cheddar Gorgeous, who is an amazing drag queen, actually did a whole piece based on Elizabeth I, had the most amazing costume. And did a full strip in the Queen's House. It was quite the show. I'm really sorry about this. I'm not sure why my presentation has frozen, but I can, let me see if I can start presenting again. Okay, it's not working. I will maybe just try to present from here. Okay, so Sorry that this is not the full screen. I'll try and go back to that in a minute, maybe when it's had a chance to load. But yes, in terms of the kind of royal connections, I'll actually just go to James first, and we'll go in chronological order. So James I was very well known for having relations with his male courtiers. These were known as his favourites. And this actually caused quite a few problems in the court in terms of jealousy because of his closeness to certain members. And he had several favourites. And one of the most famous is the Duke of Buckingham, and there are love letters that still exist that were between them. And so again, I find this really interesting in terms of the spaces where being gay was permitted, and in terms of this space, it was definitely because the king had so much power, and they really could do whatever they wanted. And similarly, Queen Anne, who I'm sure if anyone's seen the movie The Favourite, you know all about. Queen Anne also had a number of female favourites, the most notable being Sarah Churchill, and she actually gifted the ceiling from the Queen's house to Sarah as a gesture of her love, and so that's why we don't have the original anymore. Okay, I'm just gonna see if I can present again. Oh, sorry, it's not working. I'll stay in this format if that's okay with everyone. Thanks, Denny. So moving on to some other objects in the collection, and we use the figure of the mermaid quite a lot in a slightly more abstract way. But this is a really useful symbol for us to kind of create connections between the collection and queer communities. Just because the mermaid is such a powerful symbol, especially for the transgender community. Because obviously the physical genitalia of the mermaid is hidden, and so these figures, these mythical figures, are able to kind of operate outside of our gender binaries, and they have this kind of transformative element because that physical genitalia isn't visible. They can kind of transition quite fluidly between our concept of gender, and so we use mermaids a lot to kind of represent our support for the LGBTQ+ community, but to navigate those questions and those contemporary discussions around gender. And so that actually leads me into the last object that I'm going to show you, which is an artwork by the artist Eve Shepherd, and this was commissioned just a couple of years ago. So it's very recent, and was commissioned for one of our new galleries that opened in 2018. So this is called Sea Person, and it was the reason this was commissioned was because National Maritime Museum has a fair few busts of dead white admirals, and you know, that's not the most representative collection of our contemporary audiences, and so the museum knew that they wanted to diversify that representation. There were actually 3 busts that were made. This is just one of them, and it was made in collaboration with the charity Mermaids UK that works with transgender and gender diverse children. And the artist Eve Shepherd ran workshops with this group over a number of months to design a bust that would be representative of them. And they came up with the Sea Person that, as you can see, has no specific gender. It's almost godlike as well, and is kind of intended to kind of watch over all people, but especially over anybody that might be questioning their gender or hoping to transition. And it's just a really beautiful piece of art. that really elevates those stories, like our dead white admirals have been elevated in the past. So yeah, if you do ever get a chance to come and visit us, please do come and see this piece. It's in the See Things gallery, and actually one of the children from the charity Mermaids UK narrates the voice for this bust as well. So it's beautiful that their voice is permanently in our gallery as well. So moving on to what I do with most of my time in terms of the LGBT programme. So we've got a really well established programme of activity throughout the whole year now. LGBT History Month is one of the biggest, and I'll go through what we're doing this year in a moment, as it's slightly different due to the pandemic. But what we usually do is we always take part in the National Festival of Outing the Past, which is a collection of talks, usually all over the country, to kind of celebrate queer history. We also run an Out at Sea Family Festival, which really celebrates a lot of the stories that I've just mentioned. And we have a day of kind of performances, workshops, talks and tours, suitable for everyone. It's a really fun day. We also have Rainbow Week during half term, which is specific kind of craft activities for families. And then one of our most exciting events is Fierce Queens, which is a queer takeover of the Queen's House, where we invite some absolutely incredible queer artists, historians, into the space to kind of reinterpret it for themselves and put on an incredible show. So we also mark Pride every year, usually with a late event for adults as well as family activities. And we've recently established an LGBTQ plus family network. This actually came out of our Out at the Sea festival, and this usually runs bi-monthly. And the aim of this is really to create a social space for queer families. We've done quite a lot of consultation with the families, and we know that what they really enjoy about it is that they are in a safe environment where their children can be around other families that look like theirs. And it's really as simple as that, but surprisingly, this doesn't really exist anywhere else. And so I would definitely, if anybody is interested in setting one up themselves, I would definitely encourage it, because we know how much the families benefit from that. And then lastly, we also have an LGBTQ plus community-led research project, which I'm going to tell you about in a couple of slides. So LGBTQ plus History Month for this year. So actually tomorrow night we have our first event, which is Outing the Past, and we are focusing on non-Western experiences of the LGBTQ plus community. It should be really great. We've got 5 speakers. It's at 6:30 tomorrow evening, and it's free. There are still tickets available. So you can see in the middle of the slide, there's a web link that you can follow, and I'll put that in the chat as well, where you can book your tickets. Everything is online, by the way, this year, so it should be quite easy for everyone to participate. We then have another event next week on Thursday evening called Free to Be Me. We are working with Lila Al-Matwi and Jane Treyas, who are going to be talking about the experiences of LGBTQ plus migrants. And Jane is releasing a book soon, which kind of profiles the experiences of lesbian women who have migrated to this country. Then at the end of the month, on Friday the 26th of February, we have our Fierce Queens event, which again is online, so it'll be a little bit different to what we usually do. But this is being hosted by Adam All and Apple Derriere, who are in the poster, in the image. And yeah, we're working with some really fantastic artists this year to reinterpret those histories of the Queen's House. But what the aim of the event usually is also to kind of elevate all of those artists and create new queer histories in the Queen's House, so that we can maintain that relevance for this community. So again, tickets are still available for all of these. So if you do want to come, you can find out more on the website. So lastly, I've talked a lot about the queer histories that we do know about in the collection, but we know there are more, and we are kind of dedicated to making sure that we continue to look for them and uncover them. And so I might ask Jo to come in a little bit later, because she has lots of experience in terms of our community-led research projects. But we've piloted these over the last 3 years, I think now, to really work with communities to celebrate and uncover the underrepresented histories in the collection. And so this version of the project is focusing on LGBTQ+ histories, and it was unfortunately due to start in March of last year and has not been able to progress because the museum has been closed for most of that time. So when we do eventually manage to reopen, we'll be starting this project as soon as possible. And so it's completely volunteer-led. We as the museum are there to help facilitate and guide the research, but every participant works together to lead on the research and also decide on the outputs of that project. And so it's a very kind of democratic process. We really want our communities to decide on the types of histories that they would like to research. So maybe if we've got time, I'll just pass over to Jo to talk about her experience of that project, as it might give you a little bit of an insight. But if anybody is interested in joining, my email is on the slide there, and we'd love to have as many people join us as possible. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you. Can I be heard okay? Yeah. Okay, right. So I was on the Women's Project, which was the second project that happened. I was a historical advisor, and I worked with people at the museum, including curators. I had been working, I've been researching at the museum since 1983. So I thought, oh, I know what they've got on women. Not much. And actually, I found quite an extraordinary amount, actually, with the help of the staff in the archive. So stuff in the library and also stuff in the collections. So as well as unexpected findings, we had unexpected outcomes too. As a result of the group being together and forming its own WhatsApp group, a network has emerged of women who are connecting with other women working on women seafarers all over the world. We're focusing on the women who sailed on Gustav Eriksson windjammers in the 1930s. So these women were kind of suffragettes looking for their next project kind of thing, having a really interesting adventure on a historic ship. As a result of what we did at Greenwich, we are now working together by Zoom and email on projects, particularly with Adelaide Maritime Museum. So I had my doubts about the project, but actually it was really successful. And I think what people got a lot out of was getting a gang of like-minded people and working together, both in the formal sessions at the museum, but also networking afterwards and speaking on WhatsApp and becoming a kind of gang of experts on this aspect of hidden maritime history. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thanks so much, Jo. And actually that's the end of my presentation. So yeah, my email is there if anybody would like to contact me about anything that I've mentioned today. Thank you, Danny.
Great, thank you very much, Charlotte. It's really fascinating to hear that. And as Charlotte knows, I signed up to take part in the LGBT+ community research project early last year, and I can't wait for it to start again as soon as possible when the museum reopens, when it's safe to do so in the current world that we live in, because yeah, it's just to see some of the archives already on that first session that I managed to get to was fascinating, and I can't wait to delve around some more into the collection. So thanks for that opportunity, and I would encourage anyone else who would like to participate to absolutely get in touch with Charlotte. And Charlotte, please feel free to put your contact details in the chat so people have access to them now as well. So thanks again for that. Our next speaker is Lucy Dale, Assistant Curator at Royal Museums, Greenwich. Lucy, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to try and share my screen as well. Right. Can you see that? Is that working? No?
Yes.
Yes, yes. Okay, great. Okay, fab. Okay. So hello, I'm here to talk to you today about, as you can see here, our Merchant Navy Oral History Project. This is something that is ongoing but has had to be put on pause, as has a lot of museum work this year. I hope I can give you an overview of our work in this area, where we stand at the moment, and how some of the involved, if you are so willing. So we generally refer to this as one project but in two parts, and this is because it sort of involves two collections combined. The first is represented by a lovely reel here, and this revolves around a historic collection that was made by our museum in the 70s and into the very early 80s. And it involves oral history recordings with merchant mariners and a few Royal Navy service personnel, I believe, that were recorded, as I say, in the 70s, 80s. And this collection formed part of a collaboration between the National Maritime Museum and the BBC, and it was used as part of a 26-part documentary called The British Seafarer, which aired on BBC Radio 4 in 1981, I believe.
Lucy, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're getting a little bit of interference from your microphone. I'm not sure if it's rubbing on some papers or
it might be
something.
It might be is that better?
That's much better, thank you.
Sorry about that. So,
that's no problem.
So, sorry, I don't know if you heard that, but essentially this collection was part of a collaboration with the BBC. So you might have actually heard that series at some point. As a result of that series, and the fact that 92 of these interviews were transcribed, quite brief transcriptions, but they transcriptions nonetheless, we have an idea of what sort of half of these interviews contain, of the stories that are there. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But this is a collection that we really are kind of digging into and investigating as we go. My colleagues and I spend a huge amount of our time acting as sort of amateur PIs, I guess, and genealogists at present. We're looking for the descendants of the interviewees, partly so that we can acquire copyright and let them know that we have this fabulous recording of their family member. And ultimately, it really is our ambition to digitize this full collection. We were really fortunate that just before the pandemic, we were able to send a sample of 12 of these tapes to the BFI for digitization, and the digital recordings made it back to us by the skin of their teeth before lockdown. And we were really excited that for the first time in around about 40 years, actually, we were able to listen to the voices of some of these people who were at sea from the very, very early 20th century all the way through to the end of the Second World War. Now, the second part of this project involves a current collecting effort to kind of keep the story going. So we've been working to interview people who were at sea in the post-war period to the present. So it's been a sort of very gradual process, and we were working on it for about a year before lockdown. We managed to interview about 14 people in that year, and as we were going, we were kind of working on the infrastructure and developing our systems at the same time. But we're thrilled with the interviews we've got, and as I'll tell you in a little while, this work is very much continuing. So this is a timeline that my very technically capable colleague put together, which shows you a kind of spread of what this collection represents. As you can see by the slightly lighter blue area, so far with the historic collection and our current efforts, we know that we represent 100 years at sea in the Merchant Navy via oral testimony. So first-hand accounts of what it was like to be in the Merchant Navy across the 20th century. I am going to suggest that it actually is an underestimate, because I'm pretty sure that a fair few of our current interviewees left the sea later than 1990, but it's a nice round number there. As you can see, our oldest interviewee from the original project was born in 1877, and our youngest interviewee from the current project was born in 1961. The interviews cover, as you can see in red here, the First World War, the last generation in sail, and the Second World War, things like Spanish flu, the first female navigating cadet who we actually got to interview, and I will tell you about her later, and a rescue of Vietnamese refugees. Suffice to say, I mean, it's impossible for me to list everything, but the scope and breadth of these stories, of these accounts, is just unbelievably vast from what we can tell. And as I say, about 70 of the tapes we can't even hear at the moment. I should have explained that. So part of the reason that we can't tell what's on some of these tapes is because of the format, reel to reel, and the age of the tapes. The composite materials can become very fragile. So this is why they need to be treated specially with by specialists and digitized before we can hear them. So those 12 are the only we've heard so far, but hopefully that will change. From what we do know, I can tell you, I've made a short list of subjects, which is insanely long, so I may run out of breath. But from what I know at the moment, what we know at the moment, this covers a huge variety of vessels, everything from sailing ships to trawlers to pleasure yachts to submarines to warships. It covers all parts of the world across the 20th century, different ports, different countries, different continents, training and apprenticeships, hierarchy, rank, sexuality, which I'll talk more about later, race and diversity, religion, war, royal tours, told you I'd run out of breath, fishing and whaling, iceberg towing, which blew my mind a bit, migration, unions, industrial disputes, mutiny, alcoholism, smuggling, STDs, accidents, illness, and even burial at sea. So, I mean, this is really a world-class collection, and we just hope it provides so much insight for audiences now and in the future to learn about the experiences of these seafarers. Now, I really wanted to go into quite a lot of detail in all of our interviews, but there's not time. So I am going to just introduce you to a couple of people from the very original 12 samples that we had digitized. I'm going to do a sort of pat on the back for our team, because we have actually managed to put some faces to the names. However, because these photos aren't in our copyright, I can't share them with you today. So I've gone for sort of introductory pictures. So this is a photograph of Brixham Harbour Brixham in Devon, taken in 1905. And John Northumberland, aka Jack North, one of our interviewees, arrived here 1 year later in 1906 when he was 14 years old. Now, Jack was an orphan. He was found in a pram abandoned in 1892. He believes, according to his testimony, that his parents went to pursue their fortune in the Australian gold rush and left him behind. Jack was one of a number of orphans and schoolboys from London who were sent to become apprenticeships on Brixham trawlers. He explains that this was often the case because mothers and fathers, families actually from Devon, preferred not to send their own sons to sea. And when you listen to his account, you can potentially understand why. He does explain, he fills in a lot of detail about the life of fishermen at this time. He talks about methods of payment, sick clubs to look after the ill and the injured, the general diet, the pastimes of these people, men and women. But he also talks about the real, I would say, I mean, the very, very harsh working conditions, I guess. He talks about extreme cold, just being wet all the time, being at sea for huge periods without returning. He talks about saltwater boils that would form beneath their clothing, eyes drying out from the salt air, and sort of rheumatic flu, which I think was quite common. And he talks as well about very specific and potentially unadvisable cures, such as bathing afflicted limbs in liquid paraffin. And I mean, I could go on forever, but the scope is just huge. I mean, even superstition he touches on. He just provides us with so much insight and so much colour into this way of life at this time. So I'm now going to introduce you to Luis Calderon, who is a little bit of a favourite in our office. You might note that this is a picture of a donkey, which was taken in 1906. I struggled to find a good introductory image, so I went with this, but I'm going to have to ask you to pretend that the donkey is a mule for the purposes of this talk, because I couldn't find a mule, and I figured that was close. It's a tenuous link, I will admit. But anyway, so Luis Calderon. Luis was born in a really remote village in the Andes in the late 19th century. And when he was still very young, he had a row with his father and stole a family mule and ran away. This led to Calderon joining the Chilean Navy. He crossed the Atlantic, jumped ship in the UK, joined the British merchant fleet, and then served in the merchant navy for decades to come. Calderon's interview is so wide-ranging. In particular, he talks about his experience in the merchant navy during the First and the Second World Wars, including sadly experience of torpedo attack. He was torpedoed more than once. But one of my personal favourite parts of his interview is when he talks about smuggling cognac into Prohibition era America. He's pretty frank with his stories. Unlike some of the other interviews that we have been able to glean and some of the contemporary interviews, Luis Calderon appears to have absolutely loved his time at sea, and when he was interviewed in the 70s, said that had he been younger and fitter, he would go back like a shot. So this, I always want to say, this is our class of 2020. These are our newest interviewees, our great seafarers who have shared their stories with us in the past year or so, until we had to stop. I'd love to introduce you to all of them, but suffice to say, we have deck officers, we have engineer officers, we have stewards, we have wives, children, and family members of seafarers. I can't introduce you to everybody, but as a brief overview, I mean, we have Remy Capo, who's up in the top right-hand corner. Remy arrived in the UK at the age of 7. He was brought by his father and worked his way up the Merchant Navy to become one of the very first Black Merchant Navy officers in the British Merchant Navy in the early 60s. Beneath him, you can see Leslie and Chris. Leslie and Chris are a married couple. Chris has retired from the Merchant Navy, but they were incredibly kind in agreeing to be interviewed separately and explaining what life was like as a family separated as a result of this, as Chris's career. And then in the bottom left, you can see John in his check shirt. And John was the one who, as I say, blew my mind with his tales of towing icebergs in the North Atlantic to protect drilling ships in the area. I'm just going to go into a little more detail into a couple of our interviewees. So this is Judith and Audrey Nichol. They are mother and daughter. We interviewed them separately as well. And what was quite interesting to us about Judith and Audrey is that their father and husband, respectively, was a captain in the Merchant Navy for much of the second half of the 20th century. And Judith and Audrey, unlike a lot of seafaring families, spent a lot of that time at sea with him. Judith was at sea from pretty much toddlerhood through to the age of 11 when she was sent home, and then would spend periods at sea after that. while Audrey often chose to accompany her husband on voyages, leaving the children with their grandmother. So this was kind of interesting, and I mean, it was great to get a child's eye view of life in the Merchant Navy through Judith, and it's amazing. The stories are so different, I suppose, and amazing what a child notices. And I think one particular highlight for me was the story of having chocolate ice cream for the first time in America, and being blown away by how amazing it was compared to what you could get in the UK at the time. But Judith also talks quite frankly about being a little girl in a very, very masculine world. I get the impression she was very doted upon, but then she talks about how attitudes towards her changed slightly as she grew up and hit puberty and entered her early teenage years. Audrey offers a lot of insight into shipboard culture and what she saw as her role as the ship's captain's wife at sea, and where her sort of role began and ended, which is really interesting actually. And she talks about the constant dilemma essentially of choosing between separation from her husband or separation from her children, which was sort of the reality of her day-to-day life, I suppose. The photos you can see here were donated to us. The actual binoculars were donated, and this photograph along with 27 others by the family. And these images and these binoculars are from a rescue of 87 Vietnamese nationals by Audrey's husband's ship in 1980 when they were fleeing Vietnam. The ship was found floundering, and these men, women, and children were brought aboard. And as you can potentially see from this photo, they opened up the containers to make a sort of makeshift accommodation. We have photos of laundry lines drying everywhere, and sort of, you know, big dinners and so forth. And they lived aboard the ship until they were able to go ashore, we think, in Hong Kong. We do have a thanks again to Audrey and Judith for a lot of items they donated. We have a list of names of the Vietnamese nationals, so we are working to see if we can track anyone down. We're speaking to external experts to see to offer us advice, and that is kind of a long-term goal, but it's something that we really hope to do, and it would be a dream to interview somebody who was on the ship as a refugee as well. Okay. This is Nina Baker. Nina was the very last interviewee before pandemic time. So Nina was the very first woman accepted into the OND deck cadetship scheme in the Merchant Navy, and she subsequently became the very first female deck cadet, working for BP in 1972 to 73. In her interview, she covers her entire career at sea, from the origins as the only woman to her final decision to come ashore. And she also very, very kindly donated a huge collection of her of diaries, of paperwork, of documentation, of photographs relating to her career in the Merchant Navy. And I picked this one today. I don't know how well you can see it on the screen, but I think it's a fantastic document that really speaks to how unprecedented her position was. And it's actually a uniform list from BP, but they've by hand crossed out certain items and replaced them. So rather than a pair of black socks, Nina is told to buy a pair of tights. Rather than a pair of uniform gloves, Nina is suggested to buy 2 pairs of white gloves. So that's kind of me explaining where we are in general with the project. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our current work and our current plans, and then I'll talk more about why I was so excited to be asked by Danny to talk to you today. So obviously our sort of general Merchant Navy oral history recording is on pause because it's unsafe at present. But we are still looking to continue this project, and once we are able, we will pick that back up. But we're also developing some additional strands. So one of the things that we are looking at the moment is the Falklands conflict, because the 40th anniversary is coming up. So we're looking to interview people in relation to their experience as part of that conflict. Another 40th anniversary is the HIV/AIDS crisis, which we are really keen to interview people and learn about their experience of this at sea. And my colleague, who is a contemporary curator, I know is currently looking to find more object-based collections items relating to the pandemic. And at the moment, we're in discussions with a number of external organisations about collecting sort of snapshot oral histories related to the experience of COVID amongst seafarers. We're working with 2 partner organisations, and our hope is to collect testimonies in the UK, but also in globally, sort of in international centres of the maritime industry. So that's kind of where we are now. Why I was so excited that Danny asked me to talk to you today is because we know that LGBTQ+ histories are represented in our historic oral history collection. The transcripts have made that clear, and we've also, in listening to some of the tapes, people talk about their openly gay crewmates at sea. As Dr. Jo Stanley says, this was a much more tolerant environment than the Merchant Navy. This is openly our old interviewees, our historic interviewees, I should say, talk about this. We've had people in our contemporary collection discussing thriving LGBT communities at sea. But it seems to be, and as I say in the historic collection, there's a lot we don't know, so I can't say for sure, but it seems to be a lot of discussion in the third person. And we want first person stories. This is a fundamental part of the maritime story, of the Merchant Navy story across the 20th century. And we want to talk to people, and we hope that people might be willing to talk to us and to put their interviews to give us an interview and allow us to add that interview to part of this huge record of life at sea in the 20th century. As I said, it's a vast collection. It has so much subject matter, but this is absolutely vital to it. So I guess this is kind of a little bit of a sales pitch to say, if you are listening to this talk today, and you are interested in potentially talking to us, or if you know somebody who has had a career in the Merchant Navy and identifies as LGBT and might be interested in speaking with us, then we would be so grateful to hear from you. The email address I've put here is the best way to get in touch with us. I should say that we are a teeny tiny team, and a lot of us are furloughed at the moment, so we can't, and so we sort of have to say to everybody, we can't guarantee that we can interview everybody who approaches us, but we are trying to get as representative a group of people as possible. So please get in touch, and if we can't interview you, that doesn't mean we will never interview you. We will add you to our list, and hopefully we can get around to as many as possible. So yes, essentially, thank you so much for listening. But this is sort of a call out to say we'd love to record you, and we'd love your story to be part of our collection. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lucy. A really interesting presentation, and it's great to see how much contemporary work is going on from both yourself and from Charlotte in the Royal Museums Greenwich. So thank you very much for that presentation. I would encourage anyone that's watching to take part in any of the Royal Museums Greenwich projects. They are really worthwhile, and hopefully you can gain as much out of those projects by taking part as the museum will be able to gain from you and your input. So what I'd like to do now is to ask all of the panelists to unmute their microphones, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about the presentations we've just seen. While we were talking, we had one question come through to us from Jim, directed towards Charlotte, asking if you're aware of Sasha Coward and his Museum from Home project. I don't know, Charlotte, if you're aware of that, if you can sort of tell us a little bit more about what that is on behalf of Jim.
Yes, so I do know Sasha. He was my predecessor and set up a lot of the LGBT programming that we still run. So yeah, thanks for bringing him up. He's an incredible person in this sector. Yeah, I don't know a huge amount about the Museum from Home project, but I do know that it was set up during the first lockdown of last year, and it's about kind of celebrating people's own connections to museums and how that actually might be something that's in their home, and still being able to engage with, you know, the fantastic collections that are currently not really accessible to us in the way they once were. So yeah, I think he's created quite a few resources online. So yeah, if you haven't checked that out, do have a little search.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks to Jo. Sorry, thanks to Jim for introducing Sasha, and thanks, Charlotte. Just a quick question from me to sort of all of the panelists. It seems like in the past, from what we were looking at, it seemed like it was more of an opportunity for people to be open about their sexuality or their gender identity at sea. And do you feel in your personal opinions that the multicultural cruise or the internationalism of the industry has changed that in any way? Putting you all on the spot there.
I'll answer, Danny. It's Jo here. I think it's changed it a bit on merchant navy ships, to my knowledge, in that it was quite often the camp performativity was based on a really British sense of humour, including knowing Round the Horn, the programme where people spoke Polari on the radio. So I think the fact that so few British seafarers are on ships in the world these days may mean that maybe one of the reasons why there isn't that camp culture. But also, one of the big reasons it's different now is that when professional entertainers came on board, then the crew themselves didn't put on shows. So theatricality wasn't in the air anymore. That was a big factor.
Thanks, Jo. And Charlotte or Lucy, I mean, you don't have to answer if you're not sure either. That's a perfectly valid answer too.
I was going to say, I honestly am not sure. I can't say that anyone has spoken specifically about the impact in any interviews I've conducted, and I haven't done enough research to be able to say, I'm afraid. I don't know if that's different for you, Charlotte.
No, I was going to say a very similar experience for me as well, actually. So sorry, I can't answer that at all, really.
No problem at all. And Jo, I know from previous discussions with you, you were looking at trying to find out some information about an organisation called Shore Leave. I don't know if you wanted to tell the viewers about that.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. In 1990, a merchant Navy seafarer was trying to set up a support organisation called Shore Leave, which was a bit like rank outsiders in the Royal Navy and the forces. So notice about this appears in the pages of Nautilus's magazine, the Telegraph, but and the address was given at Stonewall, but Stonewall doesn't think that it's got anything, and also Nautilus hasn't got anything in its record. So if anybody does know any ex-seafarers from the 90s who may know about this attempt at a support organisation, it would be very valuable to hear your story. And in fact, maybe I'm just saying this, but maybe, Lucy, you might like to interview such a person.
Thanks, Jo. That's and thanks for that shout out. So if anyone does know anything about Shore Leave, then please do get in touch with Jo directly, or with any of us at Maritime UK or Nautilus International as well. So thank you to all of the panelists for their presentations. What I'd like to do now is just to give each of you a few minutes to wrap up from anything you've presented, any main points that you want people to take away from today, whether that's to get in touch with you and share again your contact details, or if there was one sort of particular point you wanted someone to remember. So Jo, I'll start with you, and then I'll move on to Charlotte and then Lucy.
I'm on the spot here. I think I would like to say to everybody, we've heard about some great initiatives today. We've heard about a tragic history and also a history that's worth celebrating because of the changes that have been made. What I would say to everybody is just Google like anything and ask around like anything. I used the metaphor of a jigsaw before. There are so many pieces, you know, if LGBT maritime history is a 1,000-word jigsaw, then we maybe have about 10 pieces, if that. So you yourselves can be part of the creating of a fuller picture of maritime history in conjunction with all sorts of organisations, including the NMN, with its really good initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Charlotte?
Hi, thanks, Danny. Yeah, I suppose my key message is really that you know, museums are sites of learning, and we learn from our past, but we know that our past has been written in a very specific way, and it's not the full picture. And actually, that we can learn from each other as well as academics. And I really love the phrase kind of lived experience as an absolute genuine form of knowledge. I just think that the way we can all learn more about LGBTQ plus history is by inviting more people in to share their stories with us, and change the narratives that are in our museums and our libraries and universities and everything. So yeah, please engage with us, tell us what we're doing wrong, be totally honest with us. We are always looking to connect with more people, more communities. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Charlotte. And Lucy?
My goodness, I sort of echo what Jo and Charlotte have just said. I mean, our sort of catchphrase, I suppose, when we were talking about the Merchant Navy oral histories is that we want to, I guess, tell the truth, and we want to tell all of it. So so it's so important that basically that we just capture every story we can. You know, this is a tapestry running through history, this seafaring experience that's so totally alien to most of us who spend our lives on land, and it's a whole world that needs to be revealed, and it needs to be revealed truthfully and as fully as possible. So so yes, we're just insanely keen, as Charlotte has said as well, that at the museum that we just love to talk to you, to people listening, and yeah, please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Thanks very much, Lucy. I can see we've had a message from Robert in the chat that I'll draw the attendees' attention to about Royal or Merchant Navies in Chatham Dockyard, and he's added his contact details, so please all do feel free to get in touch with him as well. Chrissie, some summing up or closing remarks from you, and then I'll bring this webinar to a close.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to reiterate my thanks to the fabulous panel today, to Jo, Charlotte, Lucy. It was absolutely inspiring. I've learned an awful lot today, and I'm very sure that our attendees have as well. Thank you to Danny for leading the charge and for hosting. Just a note to our attendees that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website, and we will let everyone know once that is up. I will just put our social media tags into the chat. Do follow us, Diversity Maritime on LinkedIn and MUK Diversity on Twitter, but I will put that in the chat. That is it from me. Over to Danny to wrap up, but again, a big thank you to our panelists for your time today.
Thanks very much, Chrissie, and again, thank you to the panelists. I've absolutely learned a lot just in this short space of time, and what better way to spend lunchtime, particularly at lockdown, rather than watching the news for a change. So thank you very much for that. There's a few points that I received or that I sort of gained from this was we're using history to help inform what we do today. Charlotte, I think it was, that said stories have been intentionally hidden of LGBT plus people and by LGBT plus people in the past, and people have found it difficult to talk about their sexuality and gender identities for various societal and other reasons. And what we're trying to do now is to elevate all people in our industry. And it also struck me that while LGBT plus History Month is a celebration of our shared history, it's important to note that a lot of what we discussed has been a story of sorrow and people facing difficulties at work and at home relating to their identity as LGBT plus people, even with punishment and death featuring within that. And while in the UK we don't experience such punishments anymore, there are many places in the world where people still face state-sponsored discrimination and punishments, those kind of activities. And while we won't be able to solve that solely by what we're doing here at Maritime UK and with our networks at Nautilius International, we can help our LGBT plus colleagues to be aware of dangers that they might face in their work. And we hope that we can do this with individuals in our network, but also in conjunction with companies and other industry bodies that are taking part in our activities. We hold a number of Pride in Maritime network events throughout the year, and all of those people watching and taking part today will be very welcome to continue to take part. And the best way to stay to stay up to date with these as they're announced is to follow us on Twitter at MUK Diversity or via LinkedIn. Our next confirmed Pride in Maritime Network event is to be held on Friday the 23rd of April from 3:30 to 5 p.m. And we'll be discussing our ongoing work programme and activities, after which we will continue the networking session going for people to take part a little more informally than usual. And if you've not yet signed up to take part in those Pride in Maritime events or in any of Diversity in Maritime's related networks, including the Women in Maritime Network, the Ethnicity in Maritime Network, and the Mental Health in Maritime Network, then please do so as soon as possible. The last thing I'd like to do is to ask all of those watching live to please tell your friends and colleagues about our work, and all those who are watching a recording, please do share this video with your friends and colleagues. Together we can ensure that our industry is truly open to all, and where those lived experiences that we discussed can continue to be shared, and the history books of the future will represent LGBT plus people in the way that LGBT plus people should be celebrated. So lastly, what I'd like to do now is to say thank you again to our panelists, Jo, Charlotte, and to Lucy. Thank you to Chrissie, Clarke, and to her colleague at Maritime UK, Paul Owen, for facilitating the webinar and taking part or arranging all the technical side for us as well. And thank you to all of those watching. Please do stay in touch with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.